So the question really is, if Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living, we really need to stop and ask, what does it mean to live an examined life, or what does it mean to live an unexamined life? So I think it's the right place to start with those questions. So the first thing to think about is, what does it mean to examine our lives in the first place? And I think this question's harder than we might think to answer, because we tend to think of this as almost like overthinking things, right? So we can think about why we do the things that we do. And I shouldn't have said overthinking things. This is a really interesting way to think about our lives, right? So we can sort of say, like, why do I wind up making these sorts of decisions? Or, how are my decisions impacted by my society or even by my biology? And, fields like psychology, sociology, biology help us think about these things. We can also think about our everyday decisions, right? So examining our lives could be sort of like thinking about our everyday, like, oh, should I have done that? I wonder if I said the wrong thing to that person. I hope I didn't offend them. Did I piss my boss off? Things like that. More long term, we might think about, like, how can we do better at our jobs, or how can I build my brand on social media or whatever. But I would suggest that that's not, I mean, obviously Socrates isn't talking about social media, but right, I don't think Socrates is talking about strategic decision making. And it seems like he's not talking about this sort of like examination about like why we do things, but that it's more what we should do. So if you think about a couple of types of questions that we could ask, what should we do in terms of how can I get the things I want? And I would call those more like strategic, practical decisions. How can I get into the college that I'm hoping to get into? But we could also ask what I would say are probably deeper questions. What sort of things are worth wanting and why? And note that like one of those comes before the other, right? So, how can I get into the college I want? Maybe we have a question that's lurking there, which is like, why do I want to go to a prestigious college? Or what's the value of college? Things like that. If you think about it that way, then a lot of questions that we don't necessarily think of as philosophical questions are philosophical if they're involved what things are worth wanting and why. So when we think about things like, should I get married? Should I have kids? What we're really asking is like, what contributes to a meaningful life? Is it being able to do what I want whenever I want it? Well, if that's the case, then I shouldn't get married and shouldn't have kids, because then you can't just do whatever you want whenever you want to. And, or, what should I study, right? We think of that as like, what's going to get me the best job, or like the most money. But we can ask things like, how important is it that we enjoy our jobs? How important is financial stability? How important is it to feel like I'm making a difference in the world? Things like that. Should I study the things I'm passionate about and that interest me, or should I study the things that feel safer, that make it feel like I'm more likely to get a job, right? A lot of people don't study philosophy because they think like, well, I can't do anything with it. So then we have to ask these deeper questions about like, why bother thinking about this stuff? That's all, of course, different than the idea of living an examined life. So Socrates doesn't say that it's important we examine our lives, but that we live examined lives. So what does that suggest? It seems like there seems to be something about living it out through our actions. And so I want you to think about that. It actually seems to help us move away from a stereotype of philosophy where, philosophers, this sort of stereotype is, I shouldn't, I think about stuff all the time. And instead, if we're living something out, it seems like it's a little more active than that. And then the other thing to think about is, do you think that living an examined life involves more than just thinking about our own lives? If I'm living something out, I have to live in a world and in a society and with others. And so I'm presumably maybe thinking about, other broader questions about how could society be better, or what should society look like? So I'm thinking about issues of justice. The other thing to think about too is examining our lives internal, where we sit around and think about our lives, or is it something that only really works in discussion with others? We tend to have the stereotype that examining our lives is like introspection and thinking, but it might be very different than that. It might be that examining our lives is like having a little bit of inner tension, or having some tension that comes with like having tough conversations with people. And I think one thing that's going on in our world today is we decreasingly have those difficult conversations with people. So then it becomes harder to live and examine life for a reason that's very different than we might think it is.